Thank you, Mitch. Great to speak with everyone again. Welcome to another of our interviews, expert interviews. This is the second time that Haydn Shaughnessy has joined us, and we're going to be talking about disruption today. For those of you who haven't heard me speak before, a brief introduction of myself. I run the strategic consulting group at Hype Innovation, typically working with our clients on advisory work, helping them implement enterprise and inter-enterprise innovation management programs. So my background is in knowledge management, in market research, information management, and also in new product development. And I'm delighted to be joined by Haydn Shaughnessy, who's author and co-founder of the Disruption House. Many of you may have read Haydn's content before. You may have even read his book, The Elastic Enterprise. He has a great and varied innovation history, including being previously chief editor of innovation management and also having written for places like the Wall Street Journal and Forbes. Right now, he's working on his new product, the Disruption House, and he's also a research fellow at the Paul Merage School of Business's New Center for Digital Transformation. And he's also a fellow at the Society of New Communications. He's also written a new book, which I'd highly recommend, called Shift, A User's Guide to the New Economy. And a lot of what we touch on today will be referenced from the content of the book Shift, so feel free to go and take a look at that. But also from a white paper that we've recently published. You may well have already downloaded this. It's available on the Hype website in the reports and research section. Haydn's actually been interviewing a whole range of organizations over the last 12 months on the topic of disruption. How organizations are reacting to disruption, what's causing them to be disrupted, and what are the best of the best organizations out there really doing to give themselves some flexibility and give them the ability to adapt to when disruptions happen. So there's highlighting there some of the organizations that were interviewed, and we may well touch on some of those examples today. So what I'd like to do today is to ask Haydn a series of questions, and we're going to have a little discussion about the topic disruption and what we're seeing out there in the market, both from his perspective as well as from mine. So Haydn, just to kick us off, I think my opening question really is around pace of change. We're becoming familiar with the principle of pace of change causing organizations to be disrupted more often, and this is something that's referenced in my clients a lot. The pace of movement just seems to get faster and faster. Now, you've spoken with dozens of organizations. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about the disruptive trends that you're seeing. What are the most common types of disruption that are occurring?
Well, first of all, good afternoon to everybody that's tuned in. On that particular question, I think we really need to start by defining what we mean by disruption, because the sense I get when I talk to some people is they think it just means more and more innovation. And I don't think that's what it is. I think that when we talk about disruption, we're really talking about the breakdown of an industry structure and the reformation of that structure. And when it reforms, it tends to have new suppliers, new products, even a new customer base. If you think, for example, of course, everybody thinks of the Kodak moment as the big disruption of recent times, but it wasn't just about the disappearance of one company. It was really about the creation of companies like Lucky Gold Star and Samsung as the replacement, in a way, because they suddenly were masters of this new universe called displays. Smartphone displays, TV displays, and other displays, and behind them a whole series of companies, a whole new supply chain of companies that supplied the organic compounds that go on to inside those displays. And of course, at the other end, you've got companies like Facebook and Snapchat that actually couldn't exist without digital photography. So my sense is we really need to define disruption in those terms, that it's the disintegration of an industry and its reformation into something else with new products, new suppliers, and new customer base. Now, having said that that's the definition, I also think it means it's a very big set of questions around it. So whereas we're fairly familiar in the innovation space with the kind of questions we normally ask ourselves about things like the stage gate process or ideas generation or ideas management, I think in this instance you do have to look for ways to simplify complexity and say, if I'm going to take on the challenge of understanding disruption, I need some kind of model for that. And one of the things I mentioned in the white paper is that that model, you need to identify some very simple and a limited number of drivers. But by the way, in the course of the research, I did do a survey of 100 technologists and said, well, what do you think is really disrupting the world around you? What's really disrupting the economy? And they didn't actually say technology. They said it's the connectedness of people. So you have to think about those things. You know, that one of the big drivers, I think I referred to it in the white paper as globalism, but what I meant by it is the interconnection of people across the globe. Because every industry now has the opportunity to sell to an infinite number of endpoints, whereas industry in the past has been based on distribution channels. Making a product at Philips that you can put into a box store in any city in Europe that goes via a wholesaler to the retailer to you at a profit margin. So I think we're moving away from that. You know, I think that idea, that traditional set of that traditional sequence of getting product out there is one of the things that's changing, and it's going to change even more because now we are globally interconnected at an individual level.
Yes, an interesting point. I mean, what I think you raised a point just before the last thing that you said about the fact it's actually a much bigger topic, and because of that there are opportunities and challenges that perhaps organizations aren't anticipating. Just picking up on that globalization aspect or globalism aspect, one of the things that a lot of organizations will say to me, particularly in sort of traditional heavy manufacturing space, we're simply being disrupted by competitors in emerging markets. And emerging being a sort of relative term, it could be that we make trains and now we're finding that the Chinese can simply make trains cheaper than us. That's disrupted our market. And in a Western economy, it's quite difficult perhaps to react quickly to that. And so they're now saying, well, our scope for innovation has changed. Our frame of reference needs to be very, very different. We have to actually rebuild this organization to be able to work in this new context. And that's actually only one aspect of what you're talking about within that globalism area.
Well, it's very interesting that you touch on that, because I think that one of the big problems we face in this area is the conversation around business model innovation. And I think everybody's learned that language now. So we all talk about business model innovation, and some people talk about minimum viable product. So those two go together, business model canvas, MVP. I actually think you've hit on the more important problem, that companies need process model innovation. And there's no literature, or next to no literature around that, because people have shied away from it. And I think they've shied away from it because they remember business process transformation, which of course led to all that outsourcing, all those loss of jobs, and people fear to talk about process innovation. But I think there are some examples coming up now of companies that do understand process innovation. And I think that the model for it is, by and large, most companies need to move towards some kind of platform strategy. And even in rail, even in trains, ultimately you have customer engagement for a huge amount of time. Very few businesses have customer engagement over 6 hours on a trip from, I don't know, say Brussels down to Geneva. Very few have millions of people engaging with them for half an hour every morning on the commute, or an hour, and then back at night. So transportation has a huge opportunity to adopt the thinking of any business out there at the moment that majors on engagement. In order to do that, then they need to think of new processes based around their products as a platform. And I think that the issue for them is to get that language right and to understand what it means.
Yes, it's a great area, and I'm fascinated by that topic. Well, let's look at those other drivers as well. So we talk about globalism, we talk about platforms. What else is out there that people should be thinking about?
Well, I think it depends a little bit on what industry you're in, of course, and we know that many people are in these industries that are anchored in large investments, like in the air industry and in petrol and gas and those types of things. But even there, you see disruption coming from different angles. You know, if you look at the banking sector, the big disruption factor is regulation. And if you look at the airport and airline industry, similarly, the big disruption is regulation around security. And those are big disruptors to those industries. But what I sense, and it may not be true yet of companies in these heavily anchored capital industries, is that there is quite an ideological movement amongst the entrepreneurial community to change the way business is done. So one of the drivers that I mentioned in the white paper is creative destruction. That idea goes back to Joseph Schumpeter, who said that every 50 to 60 years we get this process where capitalism starts to break down, and there is some positive element to that, the creative destruction. But if you look closely at what Schumpeter actually says, he says that entrepreneurs really do not like monopoly and oligopoly companies, and I think that we go between periods of consolidation and fragmentation in different industries, and what tends to happen is the entrepreneurial community attacks the incumbent. I've never known a period where the entrepreneurial community has been quite so ideological about attacking the incumbent. They really want to change the way business is done, and they really want to change society. So I think if you're the incumbent, you're under pressure in a way that you haven't been before, because the pressure stretches across how you do business, to how you make profit, to what moral base you have for doing business.
And are organizations, perhaps let's sort of conventional Western large organizations, trying to get out in front of that? Are they trying to engage proactively with that startup, that SME, the entrepreneurial group, to see if they can take advantage of some of that energy and some of that enthusiasm? I guess it takes a certain mindset to engage proactively with those groups.
Well, I actually don't think it does. You know, I think it's probably a cop-out to engage with them in some instances. If you look at what you guys have been doing for the past 10 years, it's been sort of like that. You know, it's been going out to the open community and saying who has ideas. And very often, over time, those people who have ideas form companies. And so the idea that it's new for a large company to go and build relationships with smaller companies is wrong. Procter & Gamble did it 10 years ago. What's really interesting, though, when you, and I'd be interested in your experience of this, when I talk to companies now that are trying to engage with the small business community, the aggressive, disruptive entrepreneurial community, they actually don't put any real processes in place. So again, it's back to this difference between business model and process innovation. Procter & Gamble established a really superb central organization that allowed people entry to the Procter & Gamble community. And Chris Toon, you remember at the time, was managing that, and Chris used to really emphasize, we need the small guy to trust us. What can we do to build trust? My sense is large organizations have not learned that lesson and have not really instituted trustworthy innovation officers yet.
Yeah, no, I'd agree, and we're picking up the same. It's relatively small numbers of organizations that are progressive enough to give the SME, the entrepreneur environment, an appropriate channel to get into their organization. I think actually if you look at Unilever, they're doing some interesting things. There are other companies that I can't mention, but I can describe the kind of principles that they're going after. One of the things that I'm seeing is that there is an increased desire, of course, to take advantage of what's out there in the wider world. But of course, if you're a large organization and perhaps you look at yourselves from the perspective of an entrepreneur, somebody with something that could have value to, you're incredibly difficult to penetrate. You have no credibility with that organization. You may know one, two people. Do you know the right people? If you put a business proposal in, does it get past the right individuals? It's almost impossible to find your home. So what I'm saying in the more progressive organizations is they're putting an innovation window almost in place and saying, look, these are the areas where we are interested in having some creative discussions with people we don't know. But we're going to set the bar quite high. So the quality of what you submit, the structures that you follow need to be have a lot of business discipline about it, because of course if you open up the doors you could get anything, and that creates a huge amount of work. So we set the quality bar quite high, and the next question is, what legal protections are you going to put in place And
Yeah.
where do you set that bar? So if you set it really high and say, we are going to own every piece of IP of anything you submit, then of course no one's going to submit anything. No one's going to share anything with you, or certainly it's going to be limited. If you look at what Procter & Gamble said, it said these are the terms and conditions upon which we will do business. You get your 5%, your 10%, and we'll get away with that because we're Procter & Gamble, and you can't scale like we can scale, so that's okay. Of course, the lower the bar is in terms of the legal controls, then the more content you're going to get, the more variety of content you're going to get. So what I think the smarter organizations are doing is trying to say, okay, we want a forum that allows us to share to potentially anybody a list of things that we're interested in exploring. We want to give people a channel to submit to us, but we want to set the quality bar nice and high, and then we want to be able to put an appropriate level of legal protection in place, remembering, of course, that the smaller enterprises investment will always be ahead of the larger organization, and they will have already taken a lot of investment risk. So I think this is a really interesting area to explore, and I'm seeing a lot more of it developing.
Well, I think there's another aspect of it. You and I talked earlier today about, you know, if you're that company that you're talking about, and all you're doing is tech scouting, in a sense, that's what's happening. You know, I have my tech scouts out there one way or another, and I have some system for acquisition or due diligence and acquisition, or some process for partnership. Big companies not great on partnership. I think there was already a model for that. I think Procter & Gamble created the model. Other companies should just go and look at what they did and adapt it. But there's something else again, which is what you can say in some industries, what really needs to happen is some form of ecosystem development that devolves risk away from the large organization anyway. And the two instances that you and I discussed that earlier on, because I think this is the more disruptive pathway. If all you're doing is getting a new product of a small company, okay, it's going to potentially save on your innovation budget. But in the water sustainability industry in California, they're not able to solve a serious problem, which is they don't have enough water. But there are technological means to do that. You know, if you can have the sensor technology coupled to some kind of water dosing technology and all the intelligence it takes to understand which plants need how much water in different climatic conditions, you can start to create a new type of service around water and sustainability. And Epwater, a company I interviewed, are doing just that. But what they're trying to do is not say that they have all that capability. They certainly don't have all that capability. But if they can create an ecosystem-like supply chain, they can get apps developers to create the apps that do roses really well, or another apps developer that knows how to combine humidity with a particular type of fertilizer. So, you know, you start to generate real intelligence that can be applied instantaneously. Ultimately, that ecosystem might be 100, 200 companies strong. And that's what I believe we're not seeing enough of, where companies say, in reality, I need to devolve innovation risk because my future depends on me having enough options available to play out into the market at any one time.
Yeah.
The only way I'm going to create options on that scale is to devolve risk onto the smaller business community, not just go and buy one company that I like or a half dozen or set up a fund, a venture fund, but actually create a trusted business community that solves problems collectively.
Yeah, we have seen it in isolation, this ecosystem approach. It's not a common thing because, of course, these things can be somewhat challenging to create, but we've certainly seen these ecosystem wrappers where there's a common legal framework, a common set of goals, and a combination of organizations in very different walks of life, from entrepreneurs and SMEs to big corporations and academia, who will sign up to a similar set of terms and conditions to work together on something. And, of course, there's an innovation driver there, but there's also a fear of disruption driver as well. So if we can take advantage of a much larger collective group of expertise, perhaps we can get out ahead of some of the disruptions that might be heading our way. That actually brings me on to my next question, really. In terms of organizations' response to disruption, it seems to me that there's a variety of different directions that companies take. Now, in the more progressive space, there are organizations that say, you know, disruption is going to happen. It's happening at a faster rate, based upon a whole range of things we've already touched on. So we're going to get out ahead of it. Perhaps we're going to try and be the disruptor. We're going to be there pushing the boundaries and perhaps anticipating as much as we can, so that when the wave hits, we can react to it as best as possible. Then there's, I guess, a second group of organizations who just say, we don't know what's coming, but we're going to structure the organization and the way that we innovate and create and pull together the organization in a way that's able to react quite dynamically to the way in which waves hit. And I think you've picked up on some of those themes in your books. Or perhaps there's also the head in the sand approach, which is that in some industries, organizations are not yet threatened by this, and perhaps they're missing an opportunity to exploit disruptions. Are there other reactions other than those three that you're seeing? Is one more common than another? Does it really depend upon the industry? What examples do you have there?
Well, I think what's really interesting about what you've said is that we haven't mentioned a class of companies yet that goes out there and says, I really need to understand the problems of my customer base, or I need to understand the problems of society. Wouldn't banks be better institutions if they went out and understood the problems of growth and growth at different levels of society? So I think that the missing ingredient in a lot of instances is just that, that people don't start from that perspective, like what is going to be my contribution to solving a set of societal problems or customer-based problems that I have some of the unique characteristics to solve. I think we're starting to see that. I think in the case of companies like Daimler, I think they're Chrysler Daimler now, or Daimler Chrysler, they I hear are trying to move their car-to-go community onto a participation platform so that they can co-create some sense of what the future mobility is going to be like. Now, I'm not quite sure where you get with that, because I think ultimately people would love to drive cars on roads that aren't crowded. So it's not like people don't want cars, but I think there's a growing sense amongst the car-using population that they'd rather spend their time somewhere other than being stuck in a traffic jam for a long time. So in essence, I think they've got it right, which is if I can co-create the solution, if I can truly understand this consumer requirement, mixed with some imagination, because of course nobody, we know from the Apple experience that nobody can invent the types of experiences that ultimately people buy, or nobody can anticipate them all. So, but to engage with people in that way, I think is a missing ingredient in many instances. And companies don't actually, still in the 21st century, see it as necessary, because they carry a language of the customer as target, the customer as somebody to cross-sell and upsell to. So that, for me, would be one of the big things in any disruption strategy. If you're going to think about disruption and analyze disruption, if you don't have participation, you're probably not going to get a strong enough sense of it. Now, looking at the categories that you mentioned, do companies bury their heads in the sand, or do they react proactively to the idea of disruption? I think there are companies that are doing that. I think that, in fact, I think it's strange, but companies like GE are responding, in my view, very creatively. Now, they've got a huge organization to shift, so it's never going to be easy. But the way they've gone about it in industrial data, I've been reasonably impressed by. Are there companies that stick their heads in the sand? For sure. Are there companies that think, we're invulnerable because nobody can afford our investments, the barriers to entry are too high? Yes, as well. But those companies could do a lot better for themselves and their shareholders if they saw disruption as an opportunity for themselves.
So one of the areas that, or I guess selection of companies that I talk to from time to time, I think it's quite interesting in terms of their reaction to innovation and disruption, are organizations that have typically grown through acquisition and mergers. And I think that there are often chief innovation officers in these companies who feel like they're banging their heads against a brick wall because they're trying to convince the organization that actually just by growing in that way is going to expose them to certain to a certain extent to disruption, and they need to be have a broader range of innovation activities that's going to protect them in some way. And some industries this has sort of happened to already, and I've seen some sections of the paper and pulp industry, for example, who have only grown through mergers and acquisitions, and then suddenly demand for paper dropped over the last few years, the last 10 years or so, and suddenly they don't have the tools and the competencies and the skills to be able to change that organization at pace. What sort of have you explored this space at all? What kind of perhaps recommendations do you have for chief innovation officers that are battling with that kind of conversation?
Well, I think there are two things in my limited experience. My experience is limited because we all are limited, but I think that just looking at things like paper and pulp, there's the whole area of printed electronics, which does open up many new opportunities, but it's an adjacency move. And what you tend to find when companies go on the acquisition trail in order to grow, if they do get growth, or they even talk about synergies, part of the problem is they retreat to core competency as their operating ideal, because that's the only way to integrate. So it's very hard to acquire a load of companies and say, we're going to be X, Y, and Z tomorrow rather than A, B, and C. What you tend to see executives say instead is, we're integrating you into the core competency of A, B, and C. Now that's I think the frustration for the Chief Innovation Officer, because the opportunity to change culturally becomes much more limited when companies grow by acquisition.
Yeah.
The fact of trying to say, of any executive these days saying, I need to grow by adjacency is difficult, because they're schooled all the management education of the past 30 years. If you think about where that comes from, the big managerial texts of the 80s and 90s, and I talk about this in quite some detail, monotonous detail you might say, in Shift, that what that education consists of is educating managers who'd been managing monopolies. So even in America, go back to the 1980s, and many organizations were monopolistic. Suddenly they were broken out, these monopolies were broken down. Think of AT&T. So suddenly you have this generation of managers who've been used to dictating the price to the customer and really just raking the cash in from that. Now they're in a competitive environment. So you've got texts like Michael Porter's Competitive Advantage, and that whole generation of core competency writing. It's all geared towards trying to assuage the fears of a generation of managers who've never faced competition. Unfortunately, that educational barrage is still in everybody's head, and it's still being taught. Whereas what we really need to teach now is forget core competency, think about the intelligent adjacencies you can make, think about the new competencies you can acquire, and think about how you can actually shape markets differently. But as yet, there is, I don't believe, a strong enough literature around that. And I think business schools are still the post-monopoly management executive.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier about really understanding the customer. And I think that an adjacency to that, and a trend that I'm seeing actually is trends and trend analysis and an observation of what trends are occurring, be they micro, macro, what have you. I think that obviously organizations need to have a view on trends and to be interpreting what they're seeing and then providing some judgments on that. But is that the full picture? What's your take on this? Is that sufficient really to help organizations at least build an understanding of what's likely to happen?
Well, obviously I don't think that, but I almost want to agree with you for once, so that we reach a rapport here. But the reason I don't agree with it, I think a lot of organizations strip trend analysis out. A lot of organizations close down their strategic research departments with the anthropologists and sociologists, philosophers, and all the rest. And they did it, I think, partly because they saw companies like Apple rise purely through their user experience skills and miniaturization skills and these types of things. So I know about 5, maybe even 10 years ago now, Philips closed all that down and went for this kind of technological simplicity. And I think a lot of companies have done that. But I think that the problem is trends. What are trends going to tell you, really? You know, if you, it's almost like government figures on growth. I think what people need to understand is the break in the trend, that when the trend ends, you know, the fact that, or the fact that sometimes what we think of as trends are fashion, or as ephemeral as fashion. What we really need to be able to do is to understand how a market or how an industry is being pressured to change in a fundamental way. And this is a wonderful period for teaching yourself how to do that. If you look at the banking sector, or if you look back at smartphones, you can see that these are instances where business changed. The way we do business changed because of the changes that are taking place or have taken place in these organizations. So what you really need to do is have disruption analysis. And once again, this is kind of thin on the ground. There isn't enough literature out there about it. There aren't enough practitioners. But I would say if you can't analyze disruption, if you do not understand how industries break down in very patterned ways, there's lots of commonality in how it happens, then you're going to be hard pushed to respond to it.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to come back to some of those themes a little bit later. I just want to take a quick pause and remind people, if you have questions that emerge as we're talking here, please feel free to pop them into the question box on GoToMeeting on the side of your screen. If they pop up and we have time, I'll try and address them as through the natural flow of the discussion. If not, we'll try and address them towards the end. So I want to take a side step, Haydn. One of the things that you mentioned in your paper is the rise of the CFO in innovation, and I think this is a really fascinating area because for many years, from what I've seen, CFOs have been kept out of the innovation conversation, and in fact, chief innovation officers or VPs of innovation have been resistant to people that they feel may block and stop new initiatives due to the level of investment that's required. But I think you're noticing a change there, and there are certain progressive organizations out there that are getting the chief financial officers involved. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about this, because I think this is very, very interesting.
Well, I do think that. I think that, look at Google, they just hired a CFO from a major bank, and Google is just starting to function in the payment space. Well, it's been trying for a few years, but it just looks as though it's getting the formula right. So I think they hired from Morgan Stanley, I'm not quite sure. So suddenly, why do they do that? Just to look after their books? No, because they know that CFO has a critical role to play here. And I see it in other areas, and I think that there's a very, very good reason for it. And I think why we don't recognize it is because we are siloed. All organizations are siloed. If you look at what CFOs are being asked to do at the moment, though, they're being asked to contribute to growth, clearly. Everybody's got to contribute to growth. But growth's very hard to find. So then there's another area of this, which I'll go on to. But if you look at the conventional company, it's now operating in the first, second, and third cities of China, and it may be an American computer manufacturer or distributor, or it may be trying to penetrate the African market, or it may be trying to penetrate other areas of the Asia Pacific. Well, actually, institutionally, those companies are very badly served by the overall financial structure of the world, the global financial structure dominated from New York, London, Frankfurt, does not serve companies in those areas. I mean, in some cases, the clearing system doesn't even settle the currencies. So you've suddenly got CFOs functioning at a level where they don't know where their money is. They don't know. They know they've got invoices and POs out there, but they don't know when that money is coming in. They don't know even when it's coming necessarily where it is. Has it come in? Because they're now functioning probably with 2,000 or 3,000 bank accounts. So they themselves are suddenly subject to all the forces of innovation, which the Chief Innovation Officer has been trying to tell them, it's tough. So I think that there's a sensitivity arising because of that. I think that in their treasury departments, they're being forced to innovate and prove their worth. And I think that alone is making some CFOs realize that they are actually pivotal to the whole organization's potential for growth and potential for innovation. Now, there are, I think, other examples where it's even more pronounced, and if you look at Uber or Airbnb, what are these organizations except for transaction engines?
Yeah.
They have an app, they have a platform, but day by day their business is getting money in and giving money out. So you've got this new class of company that can't function without an innovative CFO. And I think we'll see more and more of that. And there are many other classes of enterprise arising or emerging, I think, that have similar characteristics or analogous characteristics where the CFO becomes more and more important. The next question is, how does the Chief Innovation Officer build a better rapport with the CFO? Because historically, in the innovation space, we've seen that as a barrier.
Yeah.
But I think that there's an opportunity now to offer innovation services to the CFO and offer structured innovation and partner up a bit.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and this is music to my ears, because I think over the last few years, what I've been trying to guide chief innovation officers towards is a conversation, at least starts off with talking about innovation growth gap. So, are we investing in innovation sufficiently to help us meet the targets that we have at whatever period of time? And of course, that's part of the puzzle, but not the complete picture. And then I think then the next piece that I think is really interesting is the quantification of doing nothing. And actually going back to, that's one of the points I made earlier around these organizations that have only ever grown through acquisition. If we quantify standing still for a little bit, we know that over time our revenues are going to drop. We know that new competitors went to the market. We know that we can't just stand still. And so the reaction historically perhaps has been to acquire. And of course will continue to be in many industries, but also is there another path as well? And what I always felt from a chief innovation officer perspective is it was never a firefight. They were saying, we need this particular investment, this particular product, this particular service to be able to drive this amount of revenue. And the finance directors or the chief finance officers were saying, yes, but that's going to cost us all this money. But actually what they weren't adding into the equation was the cost of not doing anything. And actually making that a fair fight, quantifying the standing still position, and knowing that your revenues are going to drop over time, then makes it a more balanced conversation. Are you sensing more maturity then in those kind of conversations?
Well, I don't think I am sensing any more maturity in that conversation. I think that the conflict remains. I think it's up to this Chief Innovation Officer to offer more rather than ask for more. So, that reverses the dynamic to a certain extent. Yeah. But I do think as well that if you look at what's ahead for many organizations, things like digital currencies, it's hitting us at the moment at a superficial level. So some organizations take Bitcoin. They don't actually take Bitcoin. They work with a Bitcoin exchange like BitPay or something like that. So in the end, they get dollars in, not Bitcoin in. But you're seeing the Bank of England and the Fed in America saying we really have to take this seriously. So it seems to me that even more innovation is going to come in through the CFO office. So it becomes more and more critical that we develop a much more intelligent dialogue with CFOs. In the context of my work, that's really about disruption, and I don't think that many chief innovation officers take disruption that seriously, because they themselves are schooled in incremental innovation, or well, great products doesn't have to be just an incremental innovation. Even when you look internally, if you say the first application of your platform might be cost savings. In certain types of cultures, that's going to be the first application. But you can be more radical with cost savings as well if you understand the world of platforms, or you have a stronger dialogue with what the CIO office is doing or should be doing with things like DevOps and continuous delivery. So what we have right now, I think, are very sophisticated conversations about innovation over in the CIO office, over in the CFO office, and in the Chief Innovation Office, probably in marketing as well to some degree. And bringing that together in a much more sophisticated dialogue, I think, is really important, because I think even those cost savings in many organizations have reached a limit, but I think that the process changes, again getting back to the idea of process model innovation, there are process model innovations that many organizations can now make that they're not making. And I doubt that many chief innovation officers are sufficiently familiar with platform technologies to understand what they could be. So they could benefit from a dialogue with the CIO about that.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could give me as an example of one of those of a company that's doing that particular thing well, or you've seen recently that perhaps we can take a look at, because I think that there's not a lot of case study and reference points for chief innovation officers out there in this space. So are there organizations you can point to that may be at least examples of that aspect of the work?
Well, I think they are few and far between, but I'll give you two examples. In the book, I mention in some detail Netflix, and you know, the name Netflix is so often associated with Blockbuster that you almost don't want to hear about it. But there's a good reason for looking at it internally, because what Netflix has done internally is organize themselves around platforms. So there's a customer billing platform, there's a customer experience platform, customer experimentation platform, and so on and so forth. So there are no departments. Now you have kind of nominal departments. You know, I might be in charge of the billing platform, which makes me look like a billing department. But actually, as the guy in charge of the billing platform, I have to contribute to the customer experience platform. It makes no sense otherwise. So my interaction with my peers is preset, almost preordained by this idea that you all have a responsibility to contribute to platforms. And all these platforms have to serve a customer's need. They're not there because companies have always had one. Like in many instances, many organizations are stuck with departments. You know, departmental silos are notoriously difficult to break down. But if you start to think in terms of internal platforms and the contribution of different teams to the platform, and the platform's always targeted at improving the customer experience, it seems to me you've got a recipe to at least start rethinking your organization.
Okay, I just want to throw out one final question before we open it up for the community to ask some other things as well. And I want to dig into option pathways. This is one of the areas that you and I have talked about in the past. It's a fascinating area, and it's one that I'm encouraging our clients to consider. So for those of you who aren't aware, thinking about having a number of different viable options available so that as things change, you can perhaps adapt a little bit better. You can't anticipate necessarily what a disruption is going to be, but you can be proactive, and you can perhaps ensure that your organization to deal with things in a smoother way. What sort of pathways do you think organizations should be exploring? I mean, is this based on different types of disruption? Again, are there any examples that you can share there?
Well, first of all, I think we should clarify what we mean by it. I think that there is a tendency for companies to still do their innovation planning around an old return on investment model, which would be something like I espy a total addressable market of $10 billion in a particular area that I want to go after. I think with our capabilities, we should be able to get about 10% of that market. That looks like a $1 billion business, should get there after 3 or 4 years. Let's apply a discount to that, so discount the cash flow, and that gives us an idea of where we are and where we should be. And I think that kind of model is really the problem for a lot of organizations, because everybody gets tied into deliverables and milestones that often can't be met. And the idea of a real options approach to that is to say, in reality, any plan should have options along the way. So these pathways are going to twist and turn. And we need to know as far as we can, as far as is humanly possible, where those twists and turns will come, because we don't want to surprise the organization, but nor do we want to slow down decision making. So if there's a kink in the path in 9 months' time, we don't want that to be a stage gate, which is a stop-go. We want to already know that we're prepared to make decisions there, and those decisions will be one of these 3 or 4. So it's really about trying to structure your decision ahead of time. And I think of that as real planning, because I don't think that business plans are actually real planning. They're dreamscapes, by and large. But here you've got the discipline of saying, my product may go in 2 or 3 different directions. and even within those different directions, I need to cost out what different decisions are likely to have, what the consequences of different decisions are likely to have for me, and I should negotiate that with my CFO in advance. So that's the principle. I think if you look for examples of people using real options in the truest sense, they tend to be very big capital projects. So, you know, if it turns out that my dependent organizations don't deliver to me in time, then I may pull the plug on the project. But applying it to a more flexible enterprise environment, I'll go back to the example I gave earlier of Etwater. You know, if you're a company like Etwater where you're trying to do sustainability and you're trying to do really intelligent sustainability, who should you target as a market? Your future is an unknown, really. Maybe you should be targeting agriculture, in which case you'll want a supply chain that has a whole load of industrial scale production in the kind of pipelines that it takes to deliver dosing and then sensors to large agricultural projects. Or maybe your market is the urban green space in the mall, outside the mall, where the hamburger joints and these other shops alight onto around the car park, in which case you're going to want a quite different kind of supply chain. So actually what options planning and pathway says is I need to look at both. I can't deny myself access to either of those markets. I probably can't prioritize them straight away. So I need to have a plan which says at certain points I can downgrade the investment and the ecosystem building for that big agricultural market while I concentrate on this. And until I get in there and I see, you know, what kind of sensors, what kind of, and let's face it, you're going to have a much more varied kind of flora and fauna in an urban setting, ironically. You know, until I get in there and understand that, I can't make decisions. So I actually can't have a plan. And it's allowing executives to feel comfortable with not having the traditional business plan, but having pathways. Yeah. And I think, to me, that language is starting to come together, and you start to see companies deploy it. And that's, I think, the business, it's the competitive advantage Bible of the next 10 years, if you like, options and pathways.
Yeah, certainly a very different way for a lot of organizations to start thinking. Perhaps I can summarize what we've discussed so far, and now I'd like to invite any of our attendees, if they have any questions they'd like to submit, to feel free to fill in a little question box on the right-hand side, just while I summarize. So we started off by talking about different types of disruption, and you know, a fascinating area. We talked about globalism as an area of one type of disruption, and I think this is something that we're seeing more and more of in a connected society. We talked about responses to disruption and how organizations are going about that, and one of those that certainly I'm seeing, and I think you are a little bit, is perhaps a look again at trends to a greater or lesser extent. We agree it's not the whole picture, but perhaps it has part of the conversation there, to make sure we are at least looking out and seeing what's going to happen, and trying to build that into our thinking to a certain extent. We also talked about the rise of the CFO and how that's changing that dynamic between the Chief Innovation Officer and the Chief Financial Officer. And again, I think that's a very welcome change. It's important that innovation is the job of everybody, not just the Chief Innovation Officer. And certainly CFOs have an important role to make sure that they are dynamic and they are prepared to look at perhaps the creative space as well. And then we just most recently talked about option pathways, which I think, you know, is almost a topic in its own right. And I imagine perhaps in a year's time, Haydn will perhaps just do a webinar for an hour on option pathways, because there's a lot of stuff we could dig into there. So let me take a look at what questions we have coming in. Yeah, so one about industries, and I think this is of interest to me as well. I touched on earlier you know, the paper pulp industry. We've also seen heavy manufacturing in Europe, for example, being disrupted heavily from emerging industries. And you touched on financial services a number of times today. Is financial services one of those industries where you think, yes, the way that it's structured, the level of adventure that exists, this isn't the sort of the next industry that's going to be significantly disrupted? Or, I mean, obviously we're seeing some of those disruptions already, but you know, I'm not seeing a massive reaction in some of these big financial institutions.
No, and I think the reason is that they see, well, they have the ability to put together a $200 million venture fund and believe they can solve the problem that way. And I think that's 10% of the answer. It's very difficult to convince deal makers that they actually need to learn, and they need to learn a different trade and need to learn more about how their organisation should work or could work in a different environment. But I think that there is something else, and it's perhaps illustrable by looking at Lego. Of course, Lego, in some senses, is a traditional manufacturer. It just happens to make plastic blocks and puts them in packaging, puts them into shops, and sells them that way. But we know they've always had a strong participation strategy as well. They've always had a big fan base. But my understanding now is that the next generation for the next iteration of Lego as a company is to let the community with the Lego engineers co-design products and just license that out to people to go and take almost like an iTunes card to the local 3D print shop. Mm-hmm. So suddenly there is no warehousing. Well, it takes time to change, but there would be no warehousing, and there would be no packaging, and there would be none of these costs. So you can imagine a situation where Lego says, if I can sell, I don't know, 10 million of these license cards with where the person can go along and just hand it over to the 3D print shop who can barcode scan it, and then it starts to build in front of them. You've got a much cheaper way of doing business, and for Lego you start to become a transaction company, right, rather than an industrial manufacturing company. Mm-hmm. And I think those types of changes are not open to view, broadly speaking, yet. I mean, I actually think they are, and if you look closely enough, there are many organizations that you can see would not have to be in manufacturing, but maybe we're 3 years away from that beginning in any scale, and we're 10 years before it becomes commonplace. Having said that, I think Mattel would want to get there first, so we might see it a lot quicker.
So another question for you here, and again, this is another topic that's sort of close to my heart, which is around the balanced portfolio. And maybe I can sort of paraphrase what's been written and also add some my own thoughts into this conversation. It's noticeable to me that one response I'm seeing to disruption is the acceptance that we need more of a balanced portfolio. So organizations are often investing in parallel into short, medium, and longer term things. And I'm noticing that innovation professionals specifically that perhaps normally may have focused on the strategic portfolio are also more open to investing in the incremental space. And I'm wondering about how that sort of marries up to building an organization that's flexible and adapting to disruptions. Are these principles actually counter to each other or actually complementary? Because I think this is one of those areas where organizations at least believe that this will help them react to disruptions.
I'm not sure that it's very different from what used to happen. If you look at, now going back, say, if you go back 10 years, and look at what Philips was doing at that stage. I remember interviewing the chief design officer at Philips, probably was a decade ago now, where he said we operate on a 2-5-7 cycle. Right. So basically, we're always, some part of our labs is always working on 7 years out, and we jump a lot of it. But some of it matures into the 5-year cycle, and then some of it becomes more product focused around about the 2-year point in the cycle. So I actually don't know that balanced portfolio is very different, and I think it maybe misses some of the more important things that companies have to do, which is, and you see Philips try to do this, but not very successfully. Autodesk have done it very successfully, which was to convert everybody from purchasing products to buying subscriptions. So the conversion from product margin to downstream revenue strikes me as the more important change, because once you go to downstream revenue, you have to build community, and you have to engage community over time, and you actually have to invest in new skills, and you also need to say, well, actually it matters that I have a community manager. So you become much more humanistic in your organization suddenly. So I don't mean to say the balanced portfolio is unimportant. I just believe that actually there are more important things to focus on.
Yeah. Great. Well, I noticed that we're coming up to our time here today, so I really want to say thank you very much, Haydn, for spending your time and talking about this area of disruption. It's a vast area. I feel like we've only really just scratched the surface, but maybe we'll come back and talk about some aspects of this in more detail in the future. So it just leaves me to, again, thank our contributor, Haydn, but also to the people that have joined today. As I mentioned earlier, you can download this report on our website, Hype Innovation Resources Reports Research, and also, take a look at Haydn's book Shift. Again, this area and others besides are detailed with much more rigor than we can possibly cover in an hour. So thank you, everybody. I look forward to joining you all on our next webinar.